And I'm happy that Dr. Hansen agreed to come down here and join us for today's event. Dr. Pete Hansen is a distinguished professor of animal sciences and the Department of Animal Sciences at the University of Florida, and has done a lot of work in this area. Around the world, his research is recognized as a leading source of information for the effects of heat stress on reproduction in cattle, both dairy and beef. And so with that, Pete, thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much. I had David Riley teach me how to use the clicker, because I wanted to defend the University of Florida. So this is a photograph that I used at the Beef Cattle Short Course because I thought it was a great way to introduce this topic. This is a cow. She's wearing an Estrotect heat detection patch. So obviously somebody's trying to breed this cow and get her pregnant. And what I want to talk about today is how does heat stress affect the ability to achieve that goal? How does heat stress affect the ability to get a cow pregnant and keep her pregnant? And what can we do about it? How can we modify the cow so that she's less likely to be affected by heat stress, more likely to be able to conceive and carry her calf to term under hot conditions? And most of the work I've done on heat stress is with dairy cows, and as I'll show you, they're much more sensitive to heat stress than beef cattle. But the biology is the same between the two types of cattle. So I have several take-home messages I want to give you. And the first one is, heat stress affects almost every aspect of reproduction. But the greatest effect is on fertility, whether or not a cow conceives after being mated. So, heat stress reduces estrus behavior. If you're doing if you're doing an artificial insemination program and you need to detect a cow in heat before you breed her, it's much more difficult to do during periods of heat stress. So in dairy cattle, for example, we only detect about 50% of the estresses are actually seen by herdsmen. But during periods of heat stress, that goes down to 20%. Cows show fewer symptoms of heat when they're exposed to heat stress, which makes AI much more difficult. The biggest effect of heat stress is on fertility. A cow that's been exposed to high elevated temperatures has a very poor chance of producing an oocyte, an egg, that can get fertilized and develop into an embryo that will make it to term. So in dairy cattle, again, dairy cattle aren't very fertile even at the best time of the year. Conception rates to a single insemination in the cool season probably vary between 30 and 40%. In the summer, they can be less than 10%. So heat stress can have catastrophic effects on fertility. And then the third effect of heat stress is on fetal growth. When a cow is exposed to heat stress during late gestation, she shunts blood to her skin so she can cool her body, which means there's less blood going to the placenta, so the fetus doesn't grow as much in the late part of pregnancy. So calf birth weight is reduced, and that effect carries over when that calf becomes an adult. So it can have serious consequences on the growth of the calf. So the second take-home message is that effects of heat stress are closely related to the body temperature that cows experience. All these negative effects of heat stress occur because body temperature rises. And when body temperature rises during heat stress, cows do all sorts of things to try to reduce their heat production. Like they stop eating, they stop walking around. So that has some negative effects on their reproduction. But also, the elevated body temperature is detrimental to the oocyte, to the egg in the ovary. It's detrimental to the early embryo, and it's detrimental to the placenta. So at high body temperatures, none of those things work as well. We don't have a really good idea what is the body temperature that causes effects on reproduction. But the best guess that I have is that when body temperature rises above 102.2 degrees Fahrenheit, negative things happen to the cow. So the normal body temperature of a cow is about 101.3 degrees Fahrenheit. When rectal temperature goes to 102.2, fertility starts to decline. So this picture is of these little devices called eye buttons, which we use to measure rectal temperature and vaginal temperature in cows. One of the handouts showing differences in body temperature between white and black Angus cattle were determined using these little eye buttons. So more and more as researchers, we're measuring vaginal temperature, not rectal temperature, because we can use these eye buttons. And vaginal temperature is a little bit higher than rectal temperature. So probably when vaginal temperature gets to be about 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit, negative effects of heat stress on reproduction occur. The third take-home message is related to the physiology of reproduction. And one of the most difficult things about managing reproduction during periods of heat stress is that heat stress can affect events in the reproductive life of the cow many weeks before the cow actually ovulates, actually becomes in heat and stands to be mounted by the bull. And so there's a broad window of time in the cow's life when her reproduction can be compromised by heat stress. So you can't just cool the cow on the day you want to breed her and expect she's going to be fertile. So when I first learned about this, this really surprised me. If a cow comes in heat today, she's going to ovulate an egg later today or tomorrow. Well, that egg started growing more than 3 months earlier, about 100 days, 120 days earlier. And we now know that things that happen to that cow 3 weeks, 2 months before she ovulates that egg can affect how that egg forms and compromise fertility. So all this slide says is that the early oocyte begins growing in a follicle about 120 days before ovulation. And there's some experiments from Brazil that say even 105 days before ovulation, heat stress can affect that egg so that it's less likely to become an embryo 100 days later when it's fertilized by sperm. And then once the egg ovulates, once it's released from the ovary, goes into the oviduct and then the uterus, it's continued to be sensitive to elevated body temperature. Then after the embryo is formed, the early embryo is sensitive to heat stress. But beginning about 2 to 3 days after ovulation, the new embryo becomes resistant to elevated temperature. So if you heat stress a cow on the day you mate her, or you heat stress the cow the day after, fertility is really reduced. But if you heat stress the cow 4 days after she's mated, there's really very little effect of heat stress. Once the embryo's formed, it's not going to be killed very easily by heat stress. It might affect the growth of the placenta, the size of the calf, but it's much more difficult to kill the embryo once it's formed. And I'll come back to that in a bit because that's important for about the only management strategy to bypass effects of heat stress, which is, there it is right there, embryo transfer. So we usually do embryo transfer at day 7 after estrus. By that time, the embryo is pretty resistant to heat stress. So you can greatly improve fertility in heat stressed cows by doing embryo transfer. It's true that recipient cow's oocyte was damaged by heat stress, but the embryo that's going into that cow is resistant to heat stress, and you can get a big increase in pregnancy rate. You know, the bull is just like the cow. Heat stress in the bull affects the production of sperm cells. Sperm cells take about 60 days to be produced. And the early stages of sperm production are damaged by heat stress. So if a bull is exposed to heat stress today, his sperm are going to be affected 60 days from now. So these are some data from Oklahoma that just show when they placed bulls in a heat-stressed environment, the number of motile sperm went down. Then when they put the bulls in a cool environment, sperm production went back up, but you can see it took 8 weeks before the production went up completely. So if it's hot in August, those bulls are probably potentially affected in September and October, depending upon how good they could regulate their body temperature. And what determines whether or not heat stress affects a cow? How hot it is, but also how good that cow is at regulating her body temperature when it is hot. So obviously a Brahman, much better regulating its body temperature than a black Angus, for example. So it's that interaction between how hot it is and the adaptations of the animal that determine whether or not all these things happen. So, as I mentioned before, the only reproductive technique that really works to increase fertility during heat stress is embryo transfer. And obviously there's limited applications of embryo transfer in a lot of production systems. But certainly in some dairy systems, it could be used, and it actually works very well to bypass all these negative effects of heat stress. So, timed AI does not work very well. So, using something like OvSync, so you can program when all the cows are ovulating and not need to do estrus detection, that bypasses the effects of heat stress on estrus behavior, but it doesn't improve fertility. So these are some results from 3 experiments with dairy cows, where cows were either bred when they came into heat, or they got timed AI. And you can see the pregnancy rates there, less than 15%. This is an Okeechobee. Timed AI did not improve the pregnancy rate per insemination. But over to the other end of the slide, if you look at how many cows are pregnant at 120 days postpartum, in 2 of those studies, more cows were pregnant with timed AI. That's just because they inseminated more cows, right? Cows were not more fertile, but every cow gets inseminated. Whereas in the control group, they only get inseminated if they're detected in heat. So, in contrast to timed AI, embryo transfer bypasses all the effects of heat stress on the egg and on the early embryo. And by the time an embryo is used for embryo transfer, it's already acquired all the biochemical mechanisms to protect itself from elevated temperature. So these are some data from Brazil. So I always get mixed up about this because Brazil's in the southern hemisphere. So their warm months are our cool months. But these are data from several thousand embryo transfers and artificial inseminations. You can see in the cool months of the year, which are like from June through October, there's no difference in pregnancy rate between cows that are inseminated and cows that get embryo transferred. But then in the warm months of the year, say as you move from June to January, you can see the pregnancy rate to AI goes down. Only about 20 to 25% of the cows get pregnant versus about 35 to 40% in the cool months of the year. So that's the effects of heat stress on the egg and on the early embryo. But you can also see in that light blue line, which is the embryo transfer results, there's no drop in pregnancy rate with embryo transfer. So it's a good technique, but obviously expensive and not applicable everywhere. So the next take-home message, I guess, is a good message. Beef cattle are much less affected by heat stress than for dairy cows. They can be affected. Their body temperatures rise for prolonged periods of time, but their body temperatures are much less likely to rise during heat stress than is the case for dairy cattle. So why is that? You got to think about what an unusual animal the dairy cow is. A dairy cow, when it's milking, is a lot like a high-performance athlete. So if you look at guys racing in the Tour de France, for example, they increase their heat production by about 3 to 4 times because of all the work necessary for cycling. So a typical human produces about 2 megacals of heat a day, right? We're producing heat, losing it to the environment. When we participate in the Tour de France, something I've never done, you can probably tell, our metabolic demands go up, our heat production goes up, so that a Tour de France racer is producing 6 to 8 megacals of heat per day, 3 to 4 times maintenance requirements. And for that person to maintain his body temperature, he has to lose all that heat to the air. If he doesn't lose it to the air, his body temperature goes up. So the same is true for a dairy cow. So if you look at a dairy cow producing, let's say, 100 pounds of milk per day, as compared to a cow that's not lactating, that's an increase in energy requirements, an increase in heat production of about 5 times maintenance. So a dairy cow is producing just as much more heat than a resting cow as compared to as a human athlete is to a resting athlete. And so this cow has got to lose all of that heat to the air, or she becomes hyperthermic, her body temperature goes up, and she becomes infertile. So even in dairy cows, heat stress is really a problem of the lactating cow, and not so much of the non-lactating heifer. So these are some old data from Florida, just looking at monthly variation in conception rate for lactating cows in the solid line and non-lactating heifers in the dotted line. And so you can see in the cows there's a big drop in pregnancy rate in the summer, but in the heifer there's really no drop in pregnancy rate. That's not to say heifers can't be affected by heat stress, but under a typical management system where they're given some alleviation from solar radiation, they can maintain their body temperature pretty well. And the beef cow is much more like a Holstein heifer than a Holstein cow when it comes to regulation of body temperature. So this is just another illustration of this same idea. This experiment was done in Wisconsin, so not a place that you consider where heat stress is a big issue. And what they did was measure body temperature of heifers in the solid line or in lactating cows in the dotted line as a function of air temperature. And I converted the y-axis to degrees Fahrenheit, but I forgot to convert the x-axis to degrees Fahrenheit. So 25C is 75 Fahrenheit. So you can see at 25C, the heifers have normal body temperature, but the lactating cows are already starting to become hyperthermic. They're producing so much heat in a nice, comfortable day, they're already hyperthermic. Look at 30 degrees centigrade, which is about, I don't know, in the 80s. Heifers, normal body temperature. And now the cows are at body temperatures that cause embryonic loss, death of the egg. So this is the problem the dairy guy is facing. Much less of a problem in beef cattle. Beef cattle produce less metabolic heat than dairy cattle. Because of calving seasons, most calving seasons are set up so you're not breeding cows the hottest time of the year, unlike many dairy systems where cows are bred every month of the year. And of course, many breeds are thermally adapted. They've been selected genetically to be able to regulate their body temperature well in the face of heat stress. These are Bonsara cattle. This is a picture taken from Argentina, but that's a South African breed that was selected to be thermal tolerant. And then you can see a Brahman there as well. Fortunately, there's lots of genes in the beef cattle world that confer the ability to regulate body temperature during heat stress. So it's hard actually to find data comparing fertility of beef cows in hot weather versus cold weather. But most of the experiments that I've found, there's very little difference in fertility between, say, spring calving seasons, fall calving seasons. So in this experiment from Oklahoma, for example, the spring calving season, those cows are getting bred in the summer, whereas the fall calving season, they're getting bred in the winter. And if you look at the calving interval for the cows in this study, there's no difference between those that are used in the spring calving season and those used in the fall calving season. And that's independent of the breed group. Even Hereford Angus and Angus Hereford, the first two sets of bars, which do not include a lot of thermally adapted genetics, there's still no difference in fertility. So fortunately, beef cows are more resistant than dairy cows. You know, that's not going to be true in all circumstances. The more like the more of the genetics that's not from thermally adapted background, the more likely it is an animal's going to be susceptible to heat stress. The housing or the environment in which the animals are kept, they don't have access to shade, they're going to be much more likely to be hyperthermic. And I do think we have to consider the fact that many people project the temperature in much of the earth is going to get hotter. These are projections for changes in average annual temperature in Florida at the end of the 21st century. So you're talking an average temperature, 3.5 degrees centigrade, or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, higher in this part of Florida at the end of the century than is the case now. So I think there's still impetus to continue to develop methods to reduce the impact of heat stress on cattle populations. And what I would like to suggest, I think I've kind of been suggesting it several times in this talk, especially for extensively managed animals like beef cattle, where you really don't have the option of providing the kind of cooling that dairy cattle producers do. The best solution, I think, to the problem of heat stress is to continue to select cattle to improve genetic adaptation to heat stress. So we already have those breeds, like I said. These are some data from Brooksville, in which body temperature was measured in August and in December. So these cows are run through a chute to measure body temperature, so that probably artificially elevates temperature. But you can see the Angus and the Hereford in August have body temperatures above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So that would really be associated with a lot of negative consequences. Whereas the other breed groups, which all include one or another genetically adapted breed, have much lower temperatures. And then I think it's interesting in December, when it's cool, who's got the highest body temperature? The Brahmin, right? Probably because they're so stressed out getting run through the chute, their body temperatures go up because of all the extra heat production. So one of the things the University of Florida is doing now is to try to find genes that exist within cattle populations that we can select for to increase thermal tolerance, and that we can also transfer from one breed to another breed without necessarily transferring all the negative genes that are sometimes associated with one breed or another breed. So the white Angus, for example, I think was an accident where this genes controlling white color got transmitted to an Angus base. And as you can see in some of the handouts from today's field day, this heifer is better able at regulating its body temperature than a black Angus. So I think there are more genes like that out there, and we're going to find them and move them around from one breed to another. David Riley mentioned Tim Olson at the University of Florida. Tim identified a gene in the Senepol breed, beef cow from the island of St. Croix, that causes very short hair to form. And he realized this is being inherited as a dominant gene, and that Senepols that have short hair regulate their body temperature better than Senepols that have long hair. So he crossed Senepol cattle with Holstein cattle, bred back to Holstein, and produced slick Holsteins. So you can see in panel A there, a slick Holstein and a wild-type Holstein. If you look at panel B, you can see that very smooth pole on the slick animal. And panel C and D shows where we trim some hair away from the flank of a slick and wild-type animal. This one gene makes Holsteins more resistant to heat stress, even when they're managed in a freestall barn where they're receiving a lot of extra cooling. So, shown here is milk yield from first day of milking through day 90 of milking for wild-type cattle in the top graph. So that black line is the milk yield in the winter, and the line with the open circles is the milk yield for cows calving in the summer. So you can see there's about a 10% decline in milk yield if a cow calves in the summer versus in the winter. But in these slick-haired Holsteins, there's no difference. So that one gene provided the Holstein an opportunity to regulate its body temperature better. So we're interested in finding more genes like that that can, basically be moved from one beef cattle breed to another beef cattle breed or to a dairy cow breed. So we're doing a series of genetic analyses to identify variation in body temperature during the summer in beef cattle, and then try to relate that to the specific genes responsible for that variation in body temperature. And we're using these eye buttons. That's an eye button up there. We place that in a CEDAR, an intravaginal progesterone-releasing device. We use CEDARs without progesterone. You can put that little eye button in the CEDAR, put the CEDAR in the vagina, and measure body temperature. So this summer we did an experiment at the Beef Research Unit outside of Gainesville, where we looked at variation in body temperature in Brahman, Angus, Brangus, quarter Angus, three-quarter Angus, the genetic population of cattle that Mauricio Elzo has developed at the Beef Research Unit. I don't have much data to show you other than to tell you we are working on this. So we're trying to identify variation in body temperature regulation between these cattle, and then later try to map that to the specific genes responsible for that. So we measured vaginal temperature, and then because these cows could seek out shade, we also put little GPS devices on them so we knew where they were in the field at the time their body temperature was being measured. So that's a GPS tracker. I think this is what you use like to track where your teenagers go. Put on a car, it's got a little magnet, but we used it on these cows. So there's some of the cows wearing their GPS devices. So I just want to show you a couple examples of the data. Here's vaginal temperature in just 2 cows. This was collected in August at the Beef Research Unit in Alachua County. The black line is an Angus cow, and the white line is a Brahman cow. So we've done this on 200 animals, but we're still collecting the data. So I'm just giving you a couple of examples. The one thing that surprised me here, the Brahman cows actually got a higher body temperature than the Angus cow. And if you look at peak body temperature, it peaks about 3 p.m., about 1,500 hours in the Angus, and it's high enough to cause infertility. And the Brahman at that time of day also has a body temperature high enough to cause infertility. And then you can see in the Angus cow, body temperature goes down into the evening, but in the Brahman cow, it goes back up at night. So I don't know if this is atypical, but hopefully next year I'll be able to tell you that. And then here is an idea of the GPS data. So this is a single Angus cow. Every yellow line is when she's walking, or yellow dot, and then every red dot is when she's resting, and then the program draws these lines. So to be honest with you, I have no idea how we're going to analyze these data. But what we want to do is say, is there variation in how much time cows spend? We can't really tell whether they're grazing, but we can tell where they are in different parts of the pasture during the hot time of the day and during the cool time of the day. So presumably, more tolerant animals might spend more time grazing during the day than less tolerant animals. So we hope to be able to sort that out. Okay, just a few final thoughts. I've emphasized that beef cattle are much more resistant to heat stress than dairy cattle, but that's not to say that there are no effects on reproduction. Obviously, the effects are going to vary from herd to herd, depending upon the pasture animals are living in, fescue-containing pastures, which are not a problem here, really increase susceptibility to heat stress. And then how much access cows have to shade and water will affect whether or not heat stress is a problem. And of course, the magnitude probably depends on the breeding season. When heat stress is a problem, if you want to use a reproductive technology to enhance fertility, Fixed time AI or timed AI is better than AI using visual estrus detection because it's so hard to detect estrus during periods of heat stress. But really, embryo transfer is the best approach. And I think the best solution, the long-term sustainable solution to problems of heat stress is to use genetics to continue to produce cattle that can regulate their body temperature, but yet still be productive. Produce good calves, or in the case of dairy, produce a lot of milk. So I'll end it there, and thank you for the opportunity, John, to be able to share these ideas.